or the following parsha of Nassau, it talks about the blessings of the Kohanim. And Gavin, you know this, and they do the Birkat Kohanim every day in Shacharit and Musaf on Shabbos and Shacharit every day in Israel. And you actually as part of Shacharit, where you say the brachot, the bruchas, and it's also there. It's in between some of the brachas, the Torah brachas and the standard brachas we say before at the beginning of Shacharit. So the first blessing is Yivarechecha, which is to bless in the future. When it's a Yud, Yivarechecha, it says here, it is clear that in the divine scheme and in Israel's aspiration, such material benefits are secondary to spiritual success. Nevertheless, Hashem blesses Israel with prosperity to enable the people to devote themselves to Torah study and fulfillment. Rav Hirsch explains that the blessing involves material matters. Since the verse of the blessing concludes with a prayer that Hashem protects us, it is clear that we speak of the benefits that require protection even after they have been granted. Spiritual blessings are protected only by the personal worthiness of the recipients, but material blessings are always subject to outside danger. So that's why it's a nice thing. We try to listen to the Birkat Kohanim we have in South Africa and the Chagim and in Israel. So I enjoy getting blessed by them, and hopefully their blessings help us.
Good. I hope so. Amen.
Yeah. I'm looking forward one day to coming to Israel and buying every single shacharit and yokening. I find it quite an arduous task. It's quite daunting for me with somebody with Barbara Mauja. I've got to hold my hands up above my head. It's not so easy. Anyway, but I believe during the week it's very quick. They don't take as long as on Shabbos. They do it in like a minute or so.
Yeah, not even.
Yeah, so it's so quick. So I think it's not going to. I think I'm nervous about nothing. In South Africa, obviously on Yom Tov they take a long time, so obviously it does kill my back. Sorry, guys. Let's continue. I apologize.
No problem. All right. So, guys, I tell you what, I had to do a little bit of research because I didn't know what the Reish Galusa was. So it's not what the Reish Galusa is; it's who the Reish Galusa is. So the Reish Galusa is actually a title. So it's I tell you, it's literally the leader of the diaspora. So it's a title that's given to the person who serves as a political leader. Specifically in the Gemara, it's talking about Babylonian Jewry. So this particular person enjoyed a semi-royal status. It was like he was almost like a president or a king, etc. Of the whole of Babylonian Jewry. In other words, exile Jewry. So now they call it in English an exile ark or an exile arch. So it's actually pronounced exile arch. So the thing of it is, I wasn't quite sure because you've got the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lahavdil, and you've got the monarch, where the H is silent. So I wasn't sure how to pronounce it, but they took the word exile and ark together. And an ark being obviously a point of considerable structural benefit. Okay, so it's going to make a bit more sense. So the Gemara is going to cite a brisa, which after it's clarified, it's going to present a challenge to the sages of the West. So why is it going to do that? Because the sages of the West is an issue that we're tackling now, that sometimes they've got a different opinion, the sages of Eretz Yisrael, to Babylonian Jewry. So in this case, the rabbis taught in the brisa, if one buys a field in the name of his fellow, we do not force him to sell, but if he said to them on condition that he will sell, we force him to sell. So what does this mean? So what's the Tana saying? So Rav Sheshe says that if one buys a field from his fellow in the name of Reish Galusa, then basically we don't force the Reish Galusa to sell, to write a bill of sale to the buyer. If, however, the buyer said to the seller at the time of the sale, I'm buying the field on condition that the Reish Galusa will sell the field to me, we force the Reish Galusa to sell, in other words, to write a bill of sale from himself to the true buyer. So I'm going to explain to you what this actually means and what this issue is and why we'd get hung up on it. So what it actually means, guys, in a simple way, is that the brisa really means that the buyer bought the field for himself. But the reason why he told the seller that he was buying it for such an important person, the Reish Galusa, and he wanted the seller to make out a title deed in the name of Reish Galusa, is because the buyer employed this particular subterfuge because he was trying to discourage any potential protesters to the sale. In other words, let's think of it. People who might seek to invalidate the sale by claiming that they, rather than the seller, held the true title deed to the land. So that's from Russia. I mean, let me give you an example. You buy a property and you're not sure if the person that sold it to you is in debt up into his eyeballs. He might be a gambling addict that would bet on 2 cockroaches crossing the sidewalk. Meantime, he sold you a property, and some of the debt collectors come and say, listen, he's entitled to satisfy the debt because we learned that with a creditor and a debtor, the creditor can take the property from the buyer, but the buyer should then have a guarantee. So why it's going through this method that he's saying that he doesn't want the property touched because he's buying it on behalf of the second party, and that second party is known as the most powerful guy in Babylonia. Nobody's going to want to toy with him. So he did it in order to keep these other people at bay. But the truth of it is, it could backfire, because although potential protesters would be afraid to contest the ownership of the land that had been acquired by Reish Galusa, when they come to Reish Galusa, there's a couple of things that can happen. Number one, Reish Galusa said, yeah, it's mine. So it's not yours. The title deed's mine. That's one issue that could come up. The other issue is that Reish Galusa could end up really, really getting this buyer into trouble to say, how dare you use my name just because of my importance and involve me in your scams? And he could throw him in jail or worse. So it does have some bad implications, Gav, to use this person's name. Let me give you an example. There are people that didn't want to lose their businesses, so they put the property in their wife's name, Kevin. Okay? And what happened? Arth, are you there? Ephra.
They lost the marriage instead of the business, and they lost both.
Correct. Correct. That's exactly it. They first lost the business, then the wife wanted to leave and took the property. Gavin said he knows women. You
lose everything.
Yeah, you lose. If the hypergamy aspect goes away, where you can't support them, they're going to take your house. So that can backfire. Same thing here with the Reish Galusa. So what are we actually saying is that although, as the Gemara is going to explain, the buyer, not the Reish Galusa, is the true owner of the land, the buyer has no documentation to prove his ownership, right? Since the bill of sale was made out to the Reish Galusa. So therefore, he wishes that the Reish Galusa now write a bill of sale, which would state that he's transferring the field, whose title is currently in his name, to the buyer. But the Brisa rules that the Reish Galusa has no obligation to do so. And it's obvious, guys, why. Because everybody is going to involve the Reish Galusa in his plot and his scheme. You get what I'm saying? He doesn't need to do that. In fact, if he wanted to, he could keep the property. What did he want to get involved for? So in that case, so he's saying, we don't force him. But if the buyer is pretty straightforward to the seller, right at the time of the sale, and says, I'm buying the field on condition that the Reish Galusa will sell the field to me, we force the Reish Galusa to sell, in other words, to write a bill of sale from himself to the true buyer. Why? Because he said that I'm not buying it. I'm going to put in an offer to purchase. And only if the Reish Galusa agrees to sell it to me, in other words, write me a separate title deed once I put it into his name, because I'm afraid that you might have gambling issues and somebody might try and collect it from you, then they're going to collect it from me. But they wouldn't dare collect it from the Reish Galusa. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Reish Galusa, and this is a offer to purchase on the condition that the Reish Galusa agrees to write him a title document to get him to do it. So if he's been upfront with the seller, even if the Reish Galusa doesn't want to get involved, he has to get involved because it's a conditional sale. Otherwise, the sale's null and void. So even the Beis Din forced the Reish Galusa to write a bill of sale to the true buyer. So what we're saying is here, it pays to be honest. Whether or not the Reish Galusa will be a very happy candidate with that, that's a different issue. But it's the upfrontness that causes this to work well, because there was no subterfuge. He said it's a conditional sale. I need to get this from the Reish Galusa, etc. But the Beis Din can't force the Reish Galusa, because it's clearly evident then that the Reish Galusa can't claim that it's his property. Do you get what I'm saying? It's evident from the conditional offer to purchase. So the Gemara basically, guys, incorporates Rav Sheshes' interpretation into the text of the Brisa, and then it draws an inference from it. What inference? The master said, in effect, in the Brisa just stated, if one buys a field from his fellow in the name of Reish Galusa, we do not force him, in other words, the Reish Galusa, to sell the field to the buyer. Now, obviously, guys, that implies that the buyer did indeed acquire the field. Okay, which means since the Brisa finds it necessary to teach that we do not force the Reish Galusa to supply the buyer with documentation that the field is his, we learn that the field does, in fact, belong to the buyer. His transaction was effective in accordance with his true unspoken intent to acquire the field for himself, and he's merely unable to produce the documentation that he would prefer to have at his disposal. So that's the inference, right? So let us say this disputes the opinion of those in the West to say, but who notified the owner of the wheat to transfer the wheat to the homeowner? In other words, the owner of the money. So what we're saying is, guys, as we explained before, the sages of the West maintain that the seller intends to transfer title to the one who he perceives to be as the buyer. So since in the Brisa's case, the seller was told that the field was being purchased for the Reish Galusa, how can the person who presented himself as a mere intermediary acquire it himself? And according to Rav Yochanan and Rav Shmuel Bar Sasrati, who holds obviously above, if you remember, that the seller always intends to transfer the title to the owner of the money. It doesn't matter what is represented to him. He doesn't care if they're silent partners or partners. I mean, if I've got a hardware store and two of you guys are in a contract together and one supplies the money and one comes to, I couldn't care. You give me the money for hardware and I'll have a delivery truck give it to you. So that's what Rav Yochanan and Rav Shmuel Bar Sasrati say. They don't agree with the rabbis of Eretz Israel. So regardless of what's being presented to the seller, it's understandable why the buyer acquires the title to the field. The reason in this case, guys, is that the buyer is actually the owner of the money. That's the bottom line. But according to the sages of the West, being the sages of Eretz Israel, the buyer who misrepresented the transaction cannot acquire title to the field, which also makes sense. Why? Because if you've got a title deed presented and saying that you're buying a property, but you're going to put in your wife's name, well, guess what? Your wife can run away with a gym instructor and take your property. That's absolutely clear as anything. And it's happened. Okay. So
that's Damon, that's why I don't have a gym instructor.
Exactly. So what we're saying is, if in the offer to purchase he says he needs a title deed transferred from the Reish Galusa to himself, and he will only buy the property on condition he gets a title deed. The offer to purchase is accepted under that condition, and the Beis Din can force the Reish Galusa to do it. I suppose it's possible that the Reish Galusa could also turn around and say, I don't want to be involved, and then the sale is null and void, because otherwise everyone was going to try and get him involved. But then the ruse is, the subterfuge is revealed. So it's not really going to protect him, because the buyer doesn't care to rat on the seller doesn't care to rat on the buyer and say, listen, it really does belong to the Reish Galusa, but the Reish Galusa transferred it to this guy. So look, at the end of the day, if you object to Rav Shesh's interpretation of the Brisa, only because of this factor, guys, it's not difficult. Because you could say that the Brisa speaks of a case where he notified the owner of the field, and, guys, he also notified the witnesses that he's actually buying the field for himself and not for the Reish Gulusa. Okay? So what we're saying is that the seller knew to transfer the field to the buyer. Seller's not stupid, rather than to the Reish Gulusa. But the subterfuge was nonetheless effective because he said to the seller, listen, what difference does it make as long as you get the money? Just keep quiet. You transfer it to the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa is my problem, but I'm buying the field. But, you know, you and I have had a chat. You've got a gambling problem. I've got this human condition where once I pay for something, I don't want to collect it from me. You know, that sort of thing. So actually, we all knew along in this particular case, in which if the witnesses had been informed that the buyer's having this true intention of getting a field for himself, we wouldn't have an issue, because we would not believe that the buyer, when he now says that he really bought the field for himself, and the Reish Galusa would really be the owner of the field. So, guys, the Gemara only means here that in addition to informing the witnesses, the buyer also praised the seller of his intentions. Okay? So that's another way to do it. Okay? So the Gemara says that there's another difficulty. So this is a discussion against the Rav Sheshes, because Rav Sheshes interprets it as the following. The master said, in effect, the Brisa just stated, if one buys a field from his fellow in the name of Reish Galusa, we do not force the Reish Galusa to sell the field to the buyer. Now, this implies that the buyer did indeed acquire the field. So let's say this dispute is the opinion of the rabbis of the West. You say, but who notified the owner of the wheat to transfer the wheat to the homeowner and the owner of the money? So according to the rabbis of Eretz Israel, we're saying at the end of the day, it should belong to the Reish Galusa, because that was the informed buyer that the seller thought. But the Gemara is saying that you could object to Rav Sheshes purely of the case that the seller A could be aware and B, they're witnesses. And then it's not a case where the seller is unaware. And even if the seller is unaware, if there were witnesses called to say that there were notifications to them, then the seller couldn't really deny his awareness. So why would the seller want to deny his awareness when in fact he was informed? Because you could say that there were 3 guys that came through from the debt collection and threatened to snap the seller in half. And quite then, the debt collectors could turn around and say, where's your property? And basically, the seller of the field could say it belongs to the Reish Galusa. And then they could say, now we're going to throw you off the 2nd story of a building, but we're going to throw you feet first. So you only break your legs, you're not going to crack your skull open, because you sold it to the Reish Galusa, because you know he's a very powerful man and we can't collect from him. And therefore we're going to hurt you until your memory gets jogged. So the first thing he's going to do is say, no, listen, the seller isn't really the Reish Galusa. It's this guy, you wanted protection because he knows I'm a gambling addict. You can go to him and he'll sort it out. You get what I'm saying? So the plot is up. So that's one of the things to consider. So one of the things that you should also do, by the way, is you should inform witnesses. Let's just give you another example. Say there's a legal firm. I'll give you a separate example. It could work the other way around. Say Ruvain is in debt and sells the property to his cousin Shimon, because he knows the banks are going to be after him, but he still wants it to be within his family, his first cousin. Or maybe his sister, he sells it to his sister with a different surname, so the banks don't know they're related. Let's put it, that's a better one. But he trusts his sister. Then in that particular case, we can think that there's no issue. Okay, there's no issue. And that is... The seller won't say anything, but maybe his sister is a little bit concerned about her brother, and informs witnesses as well in terms of the ruse, for the simple reason is that she's worried if she says that it belongs to the Reish Galusa, that the Reish Galusa will never give her the property back because he's saying, no, it's mine. You bought it for me. It's mine. So if he informs the witnesses, even if the brother doesn't want to give up the game because he doesn't want his sister to lose the property, they can always get witnesses involved. Okay. So there's another difficulty with Rav Shesh's interpretation, because if you consider the latter segment of the brisa, it says, if however he said to the seller, I'm buying the field on condition that the Reish Galusa will sell the field to me, we force the Reish Galusa to sell it to him. But this is the fundamental question. Why should the Reish Galusa be obligated to supply the buyer with any documentation? This is what I said before. Let the Reish Galusa say, I want neither your honor nor your degradation. So what do you mean by honor and degradation? I'll explain it. That I seek neither the honor for you to demonstrate for me by using my name to put the fear into the hearts of potential protesters, nor the dishonor you just demonstrated by using me and getting me involved in your plot and scheme to make me into a seller of fields. In other words, on one hand, I'm really flattered that people fear my name, and you know that. On the other hand, why should I be party to your games? You get what I'm saying? So the Reish Galusa can say, I'm not signing this document. You did an idiot thing. The property is mine. So Reish Shesh's interpretation can't account for the Brisa's ruling that we force him to sell. Now, that's a very, very good argument from the Gemara. So having refuted Rav Shesh's interpretation of the Brisa, the Gemara now presents a slightly different one. Rather, Abaya said, this is what the Tana is saying. If one buys a field in the name of his fellow, the Reish Galusa, in other words, actually the meaning here is that the same in Rav Shesh's interpretation, that one buys a field from his fellow in the name of the Reish Galusa in order to discourage potential protesters, right? So the same ruse is there, but we do not force the seller to sell it to him the second time. What do we mean? Okay, so this is the point at which a buyer's interpretation differs from Rav Shesh's. Guys, where Rav Shesh's explained that the Brisa is meaning that we don't force the Reish Galusa to furnish the buyer with any documentation, if that condition wasn't put forward. A buyer says that the Brisa is meaning that we don't force the seller to furnish the buyer with documentation. What do we mean? So that is, we do not force the seller to write a second deed for the buyer, identifying him as the true buyer of the field. The buyer actually should have stipulated to the seller in advance that he wishes for him to write two deeds. In other words, to be completely honest and upfront. One in the name of the Reish Galusa to show potential protesters, okay, and one in his own name, which he would save as proof to show the heirs of Reish Galusa should they eventually come and demand the field from him. Okay, so he's backing himself both ways, according to Rashi. So the seller is therefore justified in refusing. Okay, why? Because he should refuse to furnish a second deed, because he considers a disadvantage. Why? Guys, it's disadvantage. The disadvantage is as follows. Just to think of a scenario. If there are multiple title deeds of sale listing him as the seller, it's disadvantageous to him because it gives him the impression that he deceitfully sold the field twice. That's the biggest problem. Do you understand what I'm saying, Gav? Okay, you're falling asleep. Can you hear me? You okay?
I'm very tired, but I'm not falling asleep.
Okay, so what we're saying is here, you the seller, I've come with this cockamamie scheme as a buyer. I said, look, Gav, I want two title deeds. One, in case there are protesters that said the field should be theirs. I'm going to say I bought it on behalf of the Reish Galusa to scare them off. He's a very scary guy. Very powerful guy. I want you to do another title deed in case the Reish Galusa or his heirs don't want me to have it and say, well, it belongs to the Reish Galusa. And you'd say, okay, I want to sell the property, but you're worried. It's disadvantageous to you, Gavin, because if it goes to a court of law, it looks like you sold the property twice and got money twice for the same property. You don't have a problem. Okay, so absolutely. So what we're saying is, if the buyer said to the seller at the time of the sale, okay, in other words, being upfront, okay, and said, I'm buying the field on condition that you will sell it to me again. In other words, you will write another title deed in my name. We force the seller to sell it to him again. So you're saying, but how's that possible? Because in that case, guys, according to a buyer's interpretation, you would get witnesses. Because the misrepresentation or the disadvantageous nature of it to Gavin is that he looks like he sold the property twice and he's got no defense. Because Reish Galussa's lawyers could come and you could have your lawyers and he'd have to pay one of those parties back. But if I said to Gavin in advance, this was the game plan, and Gavin wrote them both, I would need to bring witnesses to testify that this was the game plan. So then Gavin's in the clear as the seller. You get it, Gavin? You're in the clear.
Yeah.
That's what witnesses are for. But then the based in, if you sell it to me and say, fine, here's the Reish Galussa's one, you sell it, and then you become chicken. And now the Reish Galussa wants to take it from this guy and say it's mine or whatever, or his heirs want to, then all of a sudden I've got to, I would have to go to the base din and say, no, this was the scheme. And they say, well, you don't have any proof, because the seller's not going to want to get into trouble with the Reish Galussa. It's a powerful man. So what I'll do is I'll bring witnesses and I'll say, no, this was the plot. And then the base din would force the seller to write another title deed to him personally. So the one is to put off protesters, but not allow the Reish Galussa to confiscate land. And the other one is to show the true title deed. You get what I'm saying? So that's why you need witnesses. So the Gemara incorporates the buyer's interpretation into the text of the brisa, but it notes the difficulty raised by this new interpretation. I'll tell you why. The master, in effect, is saying in the brisa, if one buys a field in the name of his fellow, okay, in other words, he buys a field in the name of this powerful guy, Reish Galussa, the titled guy, okay, of that role, then we don't force the seller to sell it to him a second time. In other words, to write for him a second deed, this time in his own name. So the Gemara asks, hang on a second, it's obvious we don't force the seller to write another title deed in his name. So why did the Bryce have to teach us this? In other words, the seller has a legitimate reason not to do so. He doesn't want multiple bills of sale listing him as the seller. Okay? So if that's the case, why does the Bryce have to teach us that we can force the seller to write a new title deed? Because you might have said that the buyer can say to the seller, listen, you surely knew that I was buying the field for myself, okay? And it was merely a security measure that I wanted the deed made out in the name of Reish Galussa in case people came collecting debts from you. And it was self-understood that I would not throw money out for nothing and buy a field without the proper documentation. I mean, why would I give a rich guy a field with all my personal money? It's obvious I'd want the proper documentation to show me as the owner privately, not to show to potential debt collectors or other prospective buyers. Okay? But, I mean, why would I do that? So it was with this understanding that you would write me another title deed in my name. Okay? So that was the inference given. But the Tana of the Brisa informs us that the seller doesn't have to provide the second title deed, because the seller can say to him, listen, I presume that some kind of stipulation was made with the one in whose name you bought the field. In other words, you want to buy a field in the name of the Reish Galussa, why do I have to give you different title deeds? I thought you had an arrangement with him, okay? And let him write you a title deed and say that you're the true owner. What do I have to get involved? So it was never self-understood that I'd write to your second title deed. But the Gemara asks with regards to that second rule, according to a buyer's interpretation. If the buyer said to the seller at the time of sale, I'm buying the field on condition that you will sell it to me again. In other words, being clear and not guys, it's not implicit. It's not even inferred. It has to be clearly stated that you will write another title deed in my name. We force the seller to write it for him again. And you're saying, well, it's obvious. Okay, because if the buyer stipulated that the seller write another title deed in his name, it's obvious that the seller must comply with the stipulation. So why is it necessary to teach us? So, firstly, it's necessary in a case where there are no witnesses. That's why you should always have witnesses, because it's he said, he said. But the Brazer's ruling is necessary only in regard to a case where the buyer did not make the stipulation with the seller himself, but only where the buyer said to the witnesses, okay, to the seller, in the presence of the seller, note that I want another title deed as well. So you might have said that the seller could say to him, I thought you were saying to the witnesses that you wanted a second title deed from the Reish Galusa, in whose name you were buying the field. So the Tan informs us that the buyer can say to the seller, this is exactly why I bothered to say it to the witnesses in your presence, because I knew you would snake your way out of it. And it's to indicate that it was from you that I wanted the second deed. And I can subpoena the witnesses, because otherwise, if it was just left up to you, you tell me to go to the Reish Galusa to get the second title deed. Why do you think I bothered to tell them? They were up with the plan. Okay? So, all right, guys, we've got 7 minutes left, but let me just see how much time we've got. How much?
6 minutes.
6 minutes and 40 seconds.
Damon, just one question for
I'm
you.
happy to end off here.
Yeah, just why was the Reish Galusa involved in the first place in the potential sale of a property?
He wasn't at all, Kev. He wasn't at all.
What was his? Yeah, just go over that again. I didn't. And why was he? What was the reason?
Okay, so
I didn't get that.
Say, for example, I was worried that I loved a property that I saw in Houghton, but I know the guy's a bit of a high flyer, and he's involved with wine, woman, and song, and you know he's got that sort of opulent lifestyle, but he's the sort of guy that could get into trouble and debt. But I don't know, because he hasn't been too specific with me. I want to say I'm buying it. I want to buy the property on behalf of a mafia boss. Why? Because if there are people coming to collect the debt, nobody's going to try and toy with the mafia boss. Do you get what I'm saying? Because they're going to get themselves killed. So I say you make it out to this mafia boss's name, and then what would happen is nobody's going to collect it, and then what would happen is that I would get another title deed from the seller. This was just to protect myself against people coming to collect a debt in case the seller wasn't honest. And the first interpretation by Rav Sheshes is that, you know, the Reish Galusa doesn't, or the mafia boss or whatever, doesn't have to turn around and say, I'll write you another title deed. You could turn around and say, listen, you transferred a property to me, I'm keeping it. Why must I write it for you? But if it is said in front of witnesses and other parties can testify, he has to do it. Because of the proof, there's the intent that it was never meant to be the Reish Galusa. Then this thing with the buyers turned around and said, look, it's not quite that interpretation. We're not forcing somebody as important as the Reish Galusa to get involved in everybody's plot and schemes. Because the Reish Galusa could say, listen, I'm very happy for you that you thought you'd use my name and you see me as that important. I'm very unhappy with you because what are you involving me with your plots and schemes for? So this thing with the Reish Galusa, according to a buyer, had nothing to do with the Reish Galusa. It had to do with the seller. Because the seller could only write the title deed to the Reish Galusa. He might refuse, after the financial transaction took place, to write a separate title deed to the buyer. Now the buyer's got no proof or documentation that it belongs to him. And he could turn around and say, but you knew the scheme. Why the heck would I buy property for a very wealthy person that's got property all over the country and use my life savings? I told you the scheme. And the seller said, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay? So then we can't force the seller to write a second title deed. But if the seller says it, if the buyer says it in front of witnesses and say, look, I want a separate title deed from the seller for my own capacity to show him the owner. So if the Reish Galusa or Reish Galusa says this property belongs to him, I can explain the scam, and as upset as he'll be, it's not enough for him to gain the property, because the one is to deter potential collectors, and the other one is to prove it's mine. So that's why, according to a buyer, if you've got witnesses that can testify, the seller is forced to write another title deed to the buyer, is in addition to the initial one he did to the Reish Galusa. But if there are no witnesses, very difficult to prove. And that, in 3 sentences, is the whole Gemara.
James, I've got a quick question. Okay. Okay. Which other rabbis agree with the buyer?
And you were talking about
the panel
and the plot, Damon, and the plot.
the buyer and the buyer. Very good.
And the plot.
Yeah.
And the plot.
Yeah.
The plot and the plot of land. Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, guys, listen, I kept it as clean and straightforward as possible.